7 levels, 24 disturbing, chilling cases from Asia. From the bizarre to the truly shocking, these are the most unsettling incidents that happened across Asia. The deeper you dive, the more bizarre the stories become. Let's start at the tip of the iceberg. Level 1. Tiananmen Square, China. On April 15, 1989, Hu Yaobang, a high-ranking official of the People's Republic of China and Liberal Communist Party leader, died. Across China, thousands of people came together at Beijing's Tiananmen Square to mourn his death. The gathering of mourners quickly turned into protests, led by students demanding an end to corruption and more political freedom. A month after the protests began, it had spread all over the country, but the most popular spot was still Tiananmen Square, where more than 1 million demonstrators gathered daily. So far, the government hadn't done anything about the protesters, neither acknowledging them nor berating them. Finally, on May 19th, Communist Party leaders visited the protests. The students might have thought they were one step closer to seeing change, but the very next day, the government declared martial law in Beijing. But instead of backing down, this only spurred the protesters on, and they didn't back down, choosing instead to remain at the square day and night. It was clear things were headed to a climax, but no one expected the turn things would take. In the early hours of June 4th, protesters and onlookers were at Tiananmen Square when tens of thousands of armed troops and hundreds of armored military vehicles stormed into the square. With no warning, the troops opened fire. At the same time, military vehicles plowed into the crowd and ran them over. The Tank Man is one of the most famous moments that was captured during the military crackdown. An unidentified man was captured as he faced off a tank before other protesters pulled him to safety. Several protesters were injured in the shooting. Those who got away would later report that they had seen military personnel arresting some and executing others. This put an end to the protests, but the authorities weren't done yet. They began to hunt for those who had been involved in the demonstrations. Many ran into exile, while thousands ended up being detained and tortured. They were then tried for counter-revolutionary crimes and imprisoned or executed. But the Chinese government put the deaths at Tiananmen Square at 200. Others say the number is closer to 10,000. But we might never know the exact number, as what happened at Tiananmen Square is a taboo topic in China and is heavily censored to this day. Level 2. He survived 2 nuclear attacks. Japan. Today, August 6, 1945, is a date that resounds in the hearts of many in Japan. But on that day, Tsutomu Yamaguchi was a 29-year-old engineer for Mitsubishi with no idea of what he was about to live through. The Japanese man had spent the last 3 months in Hiroshima for business. August 6 was his last day, and he was packed up and headed to the train station when the sky lit up in a blaze. The American B-29 bomber Enola Gay had just dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 70,000 died instantly, but Yamaguchi, who was just 2 miles away from where the bomb detonated, survived. When Yamaguchi came to, everywhere was silent and dark with falling ash. Around him were fires, shattered buildings, and most hauntingly, the corpses of people who had been alive only seconds before. Yamaguchi was treated for severe radiation burns to his arms, his face, and a ruptured eardrum. The next day, he left the devastated city and returned home. On August 9th, a heavily bandaged Yamaguchi was at work recounting the horror he had lived through. At that exact moment, he heard a bang, and the sky lit up the same way it had in Hiroshima. The second nuclear bomb had been dropped. Again, Yamaguchi was just miles from it, and again, he survived. In the weeks that followed, he displayed all the symptoms of radiation poisoning, but he did not talk about his experience for many years. It wasn't until his dotage that Yamaguchi began sharing his story as a peaceful activist against nuclear weapons. He also released a book on his experience. 60 years after the atomic bombs were dropped, Japan officially recognized Yamaguchi as the first and only known person to have been within a 3-kilometer radius of ground zero in both cities and survived. Though many of those who were exposed to the radiation died prematurely from it, Yamaguchi lived to the age of 93, but he suffered from radiation-related ailments and would die from cancer. The Serpent, South and Southeast Asia. In the mid-1950s, European tourists, especially those who were part of the hippie subculture, began traveling through a route called the Hippie Trail. They would go from Europe and West Asia backpacking through South Asian countries to end up in Thailand. But in the 1970s, some European backpackers had their lives cut short after a fateful encounter with Charles Sobrage. Sobrage was a Frenchman who spent much of his early life in and out of prison for petty crimes. As he got older, he moved to more daring crimes like burglaries, stealing cars, and pulling scams. Many described him as handsome, charming, and captivating, so much so that he got prison officials to allow him to have contraband behind bars. This skill came to good use when he began to hunt the hippie trail for unsuspecting backpackers. Sobrage would lure the young travelers into his web with his charm by masquerading as a gem dealer or drug dealer. He would then rob them, or worse. Sobrage's chosen method was to drug his victims till they overdosed, while others were brutally attacked with a knife or drowned. Then their bodies would be burnt and disposed of. He is responsible for at least 20 deaths, with some estimates reaching 31. But there were several times that authorities had Sobrage in their crosshairs and he would slip away, earning him the nickname Serpent. One time he was taken in for questioning by using the passport of one of his victims. Sobrage claimed to be an American citizen and was released. He went on the run, but was arrested in India after he tried to drag a French group tour. Sobrage was sentenced to 12 years behind bars, but he wasn't your run-of-the-mill convict, and soon had his run of the place by bribing guards. During this time, many of the cases against him were overturned. As his 12-year sentence came to a close, authorities in Thailand were gearing up to charge him for the 14 lives he had eliminated there. Sobrage would give them the slip. Just weeks before his release, he gave the prison guards sweets, claiming it was his birthday. The guards didn't know that they were laced with sedatives. More than a dozen prisoners got away, including Sobrage. A month later, he was arrested at a resort celebrating his birthday. He ended up serving a long sentence in prison, and during that time, the statute of limitations of the Thailand deaths ran out. Sobrage was released in 1997 and deported to France. There, he sold the rights to his story for $15 million, but the movie was never actually made. Sobrage remained a free man till 2003, when he decided to travel to Nepal, where he was still wanted for 2 deaths. He denied ever being in the city, but was arrested and sentenced to life. But after 19 years, he was released and deported from Nepal because of his age. He now lives as a free man, alternating between enjoying his infamy, claiming his innocence, and insisting he would sue. Seafood slaves, Thailand. Thailand's seafood industry is a huge moneymaker that feeds millions both locally and globally and rakes in billions. But behind tasty meals served at shockingly low prices lurks a secret ingredient: slaves. Many of them came from poor fishing nations like Myanmar, Burma, and Cambodia, seeking a better life, while some willingly went on board fishing boats. Others were promised jobs as migrant workers in factories or construction sites by brokers for a fee. But it was a lie. Many would be drugged, and when they came to, they found themselves on ships, trapped in a nightmare. There were no jobs. Instead, they were sold off like animals for as little as 250 pounds or $340. They are often bought by the owners of fishing vessels in Thailand. Once on board, boys as young as 13 and men are forced to work on relentless shifts of between 17 to 24 hours with barely any sleep or food in between. They do not earn a salary. Those who can't keep up end up brutalized or forced to take drugs. There is no end to their suffering, and they end up as slaves for years, bringing in shrimp and seafood that would end up on the shelves of leading supermarkets around the world. Those who are lucky to escape recount tales of torture and horrific they lived through. Some even say that they've witnessed fellow workers being executed in severe acts of violence that served as a warning to everyone else. All this just so Thailand can keep up with the huge demand for cheap prawn. Even with government reforms in place, this massive human rights violation has continued. Many believe it will never end because Thailand's economy and government rely on fishing, and without slavery, the whole industry would collapse. Level 3. Chia Vichia, Cambodia. Chia Vichia was a charismatic president of the Free Trade Union of Workers of Cambodia and a founding member of the country's main opposition party. In 1996, he was among those who helped create Cambodia's first free trade union. When the garment factory industry was just coming into existence, he helped organize them into a union so they could receive fair wages. Despite facing beatings, death threats, and arrests for his union activities, he even suffered a head injury from a grenade thrown during a protest. Yet Vichia remained focused in protecting the rights of workers. It all came to a head on January 22, 2004. That morning, Vichia was reading a newspaper at a kiosk when two men on a motorbike appeared and fired at him. In the aftermath, the once charismatic union leader lay dead. But just about everything was fishy about this case. First, instead of taking his body in for an autopsy, the authorities sent it to a Hindu temple for cremation. Vichia's family had a 5-hour standoff with them before they released his body to them. Then, days later, the police announced they had arrested the two shooters, but the men shouted that they were innocent. While even guilty people have claimed to be innocent, when human rights groups looked into the two men, they found out that both men had alibis that placed them in completely different places. One of them was even in a different part of the country, 60 kilometers away. They also found out that the police had not even called eyewitnesses to identify the suspects. Instead of going back to the drawing board, the police began to threaten those who provided their alibis and intimidate the witnesses. It was all very shady, and no one was surprised when Judge Heng Tiri dismissed the case against the suspects. But then the very next day, Judge Tiri was removed from his position and his judgment was overturned. The trial was just as dramatic. No witnesses from the prosecution or forensic evidence were presented in court, and witnesses from the defense were not allowed to testify. They were found guilty and sentenced to 20 years behind bars. They were also ordered to pay $5,000 to the victim's family. In a bizarre twist, the family refused the compensation, insisting that the wrong men were behind bars, and even began to campaign for their release. 5 years into their sentence, both men were acquitted. 21 years on, Vichia's assassination remains unsolved. Several union activists have also lost their lives the same way. It's a widespread belief that he was taken out by someone in power because his union movement was a threat to the government in power. Since his death, independent unions have gone on the decline in Cambodia, and pro-government ones have taken their place. Sector 36, India. In 2004, something strange began to happen in the village of Noida, India. A high number of women and children were disappearing without a trace from the nearby slums. Concerned parents trooped the police to register complaints. Two even named a suspect, Surinder Kohli, who worked as a groundskeeper at the home of businessman Moninder Pandher in Sector 31. But the police ignored all of their complaints, and over the next 2 years, the list of disappearances grew to almost 40. Then, in October 2006, residents took matters into their own hands and stormed to the residence. Hidden inside a sewer in front of Pandher's home, they found bags containing human remains and several pieces of clothes. An angry mob of residents and victims' families showed up and attacked the police for not investigating the two men sooner. A number of officials were suspended and dismissed for how the missing persons case was handled. Meanwhile, over 19 bodies were uncovered, and both Pandher and Kohli were arrested. At first, Kohli admitted to the crime. He said he lured victims in by offering them sweets and even identified some of his victims. He also confessed to cannibalism, but would later retract his statement. As for Kohli's boss, Pandher, he insisted he knew nothing about the bodies. Notwithstanding, between 2010 and 2012, they would be in and out of court facing charges in 13 deaths. Pander would get 2 death sentences while Coley would get 12. 17 years would pass before the 2 men would be on the news again. This time, they were being acquitted on all the charges against them. Apparently, even with the bags full of body parts, the prosecution did not have enough evidence to prove the 2 were guilty. No one else has been arrested. The Fukushima nuclear disaster, Japan. On March 11, 2011, Japan faced a level 7 natural disaster. It started when the 4th most powerful earthquake ever recorded struck off the eastern coast. 97 kilometers away, the nuclear power plant in Fukushima Prefecture had a system that automatically shut down all 11 reactors after detecting the earthquake. But the backup generators came on to keep the 3 cores cool. But worse was coming. The earthquake triggered a tsunami, and just 10 minutes after the earthquake, towering 46-feet-high waves tore through the seawall and hit land. In seconds, chaos erupted as the water had flooded the plant and knocked out the backup generators. There was no power to keep the cores from overheating, and over the next 3 days, 3 of the reactors would melt down, leading to multiple hydrogen explosions. Radioactive materials leaked into the atmosphere and the Pacific Ocean. The exclusion zone would keep expanding around the town, and in the end, over 150,000 residents were evacuated from the area. More than a decade later, barely a tenth of the residents have returned, even though restrictions have been lifted in many of the areas. It is now a ghost town. The authorities estimate that it would be another 40 years to fully decontaminate the area. Meanwhile, more than 1 million tons of radioactive water have been building up at the power plant. The Raincoat Killer, South Korea. On September 24, 2003, an elderly couple were fatally attacked in their home in a wealthy Seoul neighborhood in South Korea. It looked like a robbery, but nothing was stolen. Over the next month, there were 5 more deaths in 3 homes. In each case, the attacker had broken in, attacked the victims, but not robbed them. The police were stumped. There wasn't a lot to go on. All they had going for them was a grainy CCTV footage of their suspect leaving a crime scene. Then, between May and July 2004, 11 women disappeared. Most of them worked as escorts in the same massage parlor. When the parlor owner reported their disappearances to the police didn't think too much of it, so they knew they were on their own. Days later, the parlor owner received a call from a man asking for an appointment with an escort. It was a call they had gotten just before a few of the women disappeared. So they set a trap and agreed to set him up with an escort at a motel. When 33-year-old Yu Young-chul showed up at the motel, instead of finding his next victim, he was held by employees with the massage parlor till the police showed up. At first, Yu got away by faking an epileptic fit, but 12 hours later, he was back behind bars. That's when he gave it all up, confessing to a 10-month execution spree across Seoul. He also led the police to the sites he had buried his victims' bodies. Most times, he wore a yellow raincoat which earned him the moniker Raincoat Killer. Yu's motives stemmed from a hatred for wealthy people and escorts. Even though not all of his victims fit those ranges, he confessed to killing 26 people, but was found guilty in 20 homicides and sentenced to death. He has never displayed any remorse. Level 4. Jane La Puebla, Singapore. On September 9th, 2005, 2 people would make a series of horrific discoveries. The first was a cleaner who spotted a sports bag behind a metro station in Singapore. When she opened the bag, she found a woman's head and limbs. The rest of her body was found in a black trolley bag at a nature park. The police identified 26-year-old Jane La Puebla using her fingerprints. She was married with a son and worked as a cleaner. On the surface, there was nothing about her that should have led her to such a shocking end. A newspaper with a name and address was found with her body, and it led the police right to the condo where her longtime friend, Gen Garlejo Aguilar, worked and lived. Both women had come from the same province in the north of Manila and both worked as maids, but this friendship would come to an end over a loan 2 days earlier. Gen had gotten some money from a loan shark and Jane had borrowed $2,000 from her. It came with a whopping 20% interest rate, and Gen needed Jane, but the conversation dissolved into an argument. At some point, the argument became physical, and Gen would bite Jane's forearm. There was evidence of a vicious struggle all over the apartment. The fight ended with Gen strangling her. Then she hid Jane's body in a box in her room and cleaned up the apartment. Over the next 2 days, Gen's employers had no idea there was a body decomposing somewhere in their apartment. After her employers left for work on September 9th, Gen went shopping for items that ominously hinted at what she had planned for her friend. A chopper, axe, rubbish bags, bed sheets, even wallpaper similar to the ones on the wall. Then she chopped up her friend, put the pieces in bags, and dumped them. Instead of second-degree murder, Gen was charged with manslaughter because her lawyers argued that she suffered from depression. Gen pleaded guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 10 years. AM Cyanide, Thailand. On April 14, 2023, Siriporn Kanwong headed to the Mai Klong River in Bangpong with her friend Sararat Rangswutapon. The two were going to release fish in the river as part of a Buddhist protection ritual. But the next time Siriporn was seen, she was dead. Her phone, money, and bags were also missing. Yet the police were convinced it was a natural death. However, Siriporn's family refused to accept it. The authorities finally agreed to conduct an autopsy and found traces of cyanide in her body. They also found CCTV footage that showed Siriporn and Sararat together before Siriporn collapsed and passed. Yet Sararat did nothing to help. Instead, she took Siriporn's property and walked away. Sararat was arrested, but this bizarre case was only the beginning. It started with a woman coming forward to accuse Sararat of poisoning her 3 years earlier. When the police looked into her past, they found that the witness was the only lucky one. Over the past 8 years, 14 people in Sararat's life had died after eating or drinking with her. They would all turn out to be poisoned by cyanide as well. Most of them were people that she had borrowed money from to feed her gambling addiction. When she had gotten all she could from them, she would poison and rob them. Sararat was found guilty and given the death sentence, but she didn't go down alone. Her ex-husband, Witun Rangswutapon, who also happened to be a police lieutenant colonel, was sentenced to 1 year and 4 months for evidence tampering. Her lawyer was also sentenced to 2 years behind bars. The Goldilocks murders. On the morning of December 31st, 2000, the bodies of Mikio Miyazawa and his wife Yasuko and their 2 kids were found in their home after a brutal attack. The assailant had broken into the house through the bathroom. Disturbingly, the police found that after the executions, the assailant had stayed using the computer and eating ice cream. They were there for hours before they finally left the house. While that was weird, the perps had left behind all sorts of evidence for the police. A sweater was traced to a store in Tokyo and a knife that was bought in the Kanagawa prefecture. There were even fingerprints and DNA all over the house. Yet, with all this overwhelming evidence, 25 years on, no one has been arrested for the crime. There's never been a DNA match, and even though investigators have a vague idea of what he looks like and his ancestry, they aren't any closer to getting their man. To this day, there are many who live in fear that this vicious killer is still somewhere out there. Level 5. Chin Sui Road Murder. On Chin Sui Road in Singapore, there are several apartment complexes, but in September 2019, all eyes were on Block 52. A couple who lived in one of the units had been arrested on drug charges. They had 7 children between them, but would lie to the authorities about the whereabouts of Umaisha, telling them that she was with her father. On paper, Umaisha was going into primary 1, but in reality, she had been dead for 5 years, her body hidden right in the apartment. Sometime in March 2014, Umaisha's father had hit her so hard that she suffered a seizure. Neither of her parents got any help, and she died from the injuries. To keep their crime hidden, both parents decided to burn her body in a pot. Then they put the pot in a sealed box and hid it under a kitchen stove. For the next 5 years, the couple lived in that same flat with their other children who weren't treated much better than Umaisha had been. Fortunately, these weren't exactly upstanding members of the community, and in early September 2019, both were behind bars on related offenses, theft, and rioting. Umaisha's intellectually disabled uncle was alone in the home, and a friend stopped by to take care of him. On September 10th, the friend would find the pot with Umaisha's charred remains, but ran off before calling the police. The intellectually disabled uncle, hungry and alone, figured it was just food and put the pot on the stove. But before things could get any worse, the smell from the pot was so foul that neighbors called 911. It was the officers that would discover exactly what was in the pot. Umaisha's father was found guilty of manslaughter and other charges. He was sentenced to 21 years behind bars and flogged. While her mother wasn't found culpable, she would face several charges for her treatment of Umaisha and the other kids. She was sentenced to 14 years behind bars. Because the crime involved children and the court wanted to protect their identities, neither of Umaisha's parents have ever been named publicly. Greed kills over 500 South Koreans. In December 1989, the Sampoong department store opened in the affluent upscale Sochogu neighborhood in Seoul. The pink complex had 5 stories and 4 underground floors. For today, that's hardly a record, but in 1989, it was one of the largest and fanciest department stores and attracted shoppers from all around. But less than 6 years in, this landmark building was turned into a shell of itself, taking hundreds of lives with it. Shoppers did not know that the owner of the store, Lee Jun, had made some very shoddy business decisions when the building was coming up. For one, it was never meant to be a mall at all. The original plan was for a 4-story apartment complex. The construction crew had already put in the necessary support columns when Jun decided that he wanted it to become a department store, and that meant replacing support columns with escalators. When the contractors argued against this, Jun sacked them and hired yes-men to get the job done regardless of the risk. He also used steel rods that were below standard. An unplanned 5th-floor skirting rink was replaced with several restaurants. A few columns holding up the building were under a lot of stress, and people began to notice several cracks in the walls. Despite this, Jun decided to add even more weight on the building. It came in the form of 3 massive air conditioning units that the roof was not designed to carry. They were first installed on the north wing, but neighbors complained about the noise, so they decided to move the towers to the south wing. Instead of using a crane to move it, management cut corners, dragging 36 metric tons across an already strained roof and causing even more cracks. 2 months before the disaster, a large crack appeared on the roof of the 5th floor, and employees reported feeling the building give, but management looked the other way. On June 30th, 1995, it all came to a head. By noon, the cracks were getting wider and the roof was visibly caving in. Structural engineers were brought in and they warned that a collapse was imminent. But board members took one look at the bustling crowd of shoppers and decided not to evacuate the building. Meanwhile, most managers and executives left. At 5:50 p.m., cracking sounds began to echo around the building. Employees began to evacuate the shoppers, but for most, it was too little too late. 2 minutes into the evacuation, the cooling system caved in through the roof, bringing the building down with it. Many who survived the collapse drowned as firefighters tried to put out fires from burning cars. In the aftermath, 502 people lost their lives and almost 1,000 were injured. It's still one of the deadliest building collapses in South Korea's history. An investigation was opened into the disaster, and Lee Jun was quoted saying that his main concern was the financial hit to his pockets. 2 months later, he and his son would sign off their entire wealth to compensate the families of the victims. In the end, Li Jun was sentenced to 7 years behind bars for involuntary manslaughter. His son and public officials who received bribes to look away during the construction also got jail time. The Kaohsiung Killings, Taiwan. On February 3, 2025, 73-year-old Chow was reported missing by her relatives after nobody had heard from her in 24 hours. Police pulled surveillance footage and spotted Chow. At 6 p.m., she was seen on her scooter with 72-year-old Chang Chae-sung. The two were headed to his home. The next time the CCTV picked up movement at Chang's home, it was 6 a.m. and Chang was carrying out a suspicious black plastic bag. He did this a dozen times over the next 4 hours. 5 times, he had black garbage bags that he took to the Kaohsiung River and dumped there. Investigators went to the canal where they found bags of clothing and several body parts. Chang was arrested. At his home, forensic detectives found traces of Chow's DNA. They also found DNA samples that were linked to 2 other women who had been reported missing, including his 75-year-old sister-in-law, surnamed Huang, leading them to believe they were dealing with a serial killer. The remains found at the canal were later identified as that of Chow and a 75-year-old woman surnamed Chang. Both women had gone missing over 4 months, and it is believed that Chang had taken their lives and cut them up. During the search of his home, officers also found an ominous list with 4 names. Only one of them is still alive. The police are still hoping to find the body of his sister-in-law. Encased in concrete. On March 14, 2007, Ruby Rose Baramida Jimenez stepped out of her Filipino home headed for the bank. From there, she planned to visit her daughters. The 2 children were living with her estranged husband's parents while the court determined who got custody. But Ruby Rose would never return home. For the next 2 years, her family desperately searched for her, but came up empty. They were sure that her ex-husband, Manuel Jimenez, was behind her disappearance. Then, in June 2009, a man walked into the police station with a shocking confession to make. That day in 2007, Ruby Rose had been abducted from her in-laws' home and assassinated. He also told the police where to find her. In the waters of Navatos, police fished out a steel drum. Inside it, they found Ruby Rose's body covered in hardened cement. The person behind her death was the same person her family suspected all along, Manuel Jimenez. Manuel's father, uncle, and several others were also involved. They had taken her out for taking Manuel through a custody battle. The men were arrested and charged with her death, but what should have been a slam-dunk case hit several snags. First, Manuel's lawyer got his hands on case records that had never been assigned to him and hid them. Then, the key witness would escape witness protection and recant his statement. Ruby Rose's family could only watch in horror as Manuel and his co-conspirators were acquitted of her death because they couldn't use the witness's testimony. It seemed like Manuel had gotten away with it. Then, on January 5th, 2025, businessman William Pascaron was abducted and executed. By using CCTV footage, the cops were able to track down the men behind the crime. The men told the police they had been hired to execute Pascaron, which led the police to the arrest of one Victor Vidal Dueñas. But when his picture hit social media, Ruby Rose's sister immediately noticed that Victor looked exactly like one of the men involved in Ruby Rose's disappearance, the ex-husband's uncle. She was even invited to the station for a closer look, but Victor has insisted he isn't the one. Nonetheless, there are eerie similarities in both Ruby Rose's and Pascaron's death. They had been abducted by hired killers and their bodies were found in steel drums. Some believe that the case could be reopened, giving Ruby Rose a new chance at getting justice. Blown to smithereens, Malaysia. On October 19, 2006, former Mongolian model Altantuya Sharibu went missing. 3 weeks later, bits of her body would be found in a jungle clearing. She had been shot, and then her body was blown up with military-grade explosives. The only thing more shocking than how she had been taken out were the people who had pulled the trigger. Azila Hadri, a police chief inspector, and Serul Azra Umar, a police corporal. So, why did two Special Action Unit police officers have it out for Altantuya? Hours before she went missing, Altantuya had filed a police report confessing she had tried blackmailing her boyfriend, Abdul Razak. Abdul was a political analyst who advised the sitting prime minister between 2000 and 2008. Altantuya would often go with him on business trips involving the Malaysian government. The story is that Altantuya found out about a $1 billion deal Abdul was involved in and wanted a $500,000 payment to keep quiet about the kickbacks. She believed that Abdul was planning to kill her. Instead, he roped the officers in to do his dirty work. The officers were charged with murder, while Abdul was charged with abetting them. But in a bizarre court case where Abdul never even entered a defense, he was acquitted. That wasn't the only weird court case. In 2009, the two officers were found guilty and handed death sentences. But 4 years on, a court of appeal would acquit them. 2 years passed before a federal court would reverse that release. But Serul was now detained in Australia and didn't want to be extradited unless he had a full pardon. It helped that Australia was against the death penalty. 16 years after the grisly attack, Abdul and the two policemen were found liable for her death and ordered to pay $2 million in damages to her family, but they have been appealing the ruling. The Killing Fields of Cambodia. In Cambodia, the killing fields of Chong Ek look like a peaceful tourist attraction surrounded by farmland. But 50 years ago, it was one of the sites of a genocide. Between 1976 and 1978, the Communist Party Khmer Rouge came into power under the leadership of Pol Pot. Convinced that Western influence had corrupted the society, they were determined to rid the country of it. In this new society, personal property, religion, and individuality did not exist. Everyone was ordered to leave the city and were marched into the countryside. There, they would be forced to work as laborers and peasants, living in labor camps while wearing uniforms down to the same haircuts. Anyone who didn't fall in line was a threat. Intellectuals and professionals like doctors, lawyers, and teachers became a prime target, as was anyone who spoke another language or wore spectacles. Ethnic minorities like the Cham Muslims and ethnic Chinese were also hunted down. They would be taken to places like the notorious Tuol Sleng prison, where they would be questioned, tortured, and have their photos taken. Of the 17,000 people that were taken there, only 7 survived. The rest were transported to rural farmlands that would come to be ominously called the Killing Fields. There, they were brutally executed, their bodies dumped in mass graves. Meanwhile, without hospitals and health personnel and with forced labor all around, the country's economic situation just kept getting worse. However, the Khmer Rouge were convinced that they were getting sabotaged from the inside. Soon, even members of the party began to get executed. The killings only came to an end when Vietnam invaded Cambodia and overthrew the Khmer Rouge. By then, up to 3 million people had been systematically executed. To this day, human bones can still be seen sticking out of the ground in the Killing Fields. A haunting reminder of one of the most horrific genocides in history. Level 6. The Maguindanao Ampatuan Massacre, Philippines. On the morning of November 23, 2009, a convoy of vehicles was headed to the provincial capital of Maguindanao. Inside were Esmael Magadaratu's pregnant wife and female family members. The group was going to file Esmael's candidacy as governor. Notably absent was Esmael himself. He had been getting death threats ever since he declared an interest in the governorship seat. Esmael decided to stay away, believing that the women were less likely to attract violence. The women also had some journalists coming along with them. But when they got to the town of Ampatuan, they were stopped by an armed force led by Andal Ampatuan. Andal's father was the governor. His family had ruled for 20 years, and he planned to keep it that way by any means possible. Andal and his men ordered them to drive to a hilltop where 3 mass graves had been dug. What happened next was the worst case of election-related violence in the history of the Philippines. Andal and his group opened fire. In the aftermath, 58 people were executed, including Ismail's wife, sister, and 32 journalists. The incident shook the entire country, and Andal was forced to turn himself in. But he didn't work alone. An investigation would reveal that not only was Andal's family involved, the police and army were involved in both planning and executing the massacre. 197 people were charged with the executions. But getting justice would not be so easy, especially with a family as influential as the Ampachuans. Over the next 10 years, 4 witnesses have been executed. Others were threatened, and several were offered bribes to withdraw from the case. In 2019, 8 members of the clan, including Andal, have been found guilty and sentenced to life. More than 100 others have also been sentenced, but at least 80 suspects are still at large, while many accused police officers were acquitted. The only silver lining from this horrific incident is that the Ampachuans' tyrannical hold over Maguindanao has finally come to an end. But at what cost? China's Jack the Ripper. On May 26, 1988, a 23-year-old woman from Gansu was fatally attacked with a knife. The serial killer had a method of operation. He tracked women who wore the color red or lived alone back to their homes. There, he attacked them in gruesome and horrifying ways before robbing them. Across the town, women became terrified of going out alone and would often have male relatives or friends go along with them. Over the next 14 years, at least 11 women across Gansu and their neighboring Inner Mongolia autonomous region would meet the same fate. His youngest victim was 8 years old. The media dubbed the killer as China's Jack the Ripper because of the similarities between the killings in Gansu and those of Jack the Ripper in London. In the same way that Jack the Ripper's slayings suddenly stopped in 1889, China's Jack the Ripper stopped his slayings in 2002. The general belief was that he had either died or been locked up. However, the killer had left DNA at the scenes of his crime, so the police had that on file, but there hadn't been any matches. It seemed like history was going to repeat itself, and China's Jack the Ripper would also get away. But then, in 2015, a man in Bayan was accused of a minor crime and placed on house arrest. After his DNA was collected and run through the system, the authorities hit pay dirt. The man had enough markers to prove he was related to China's Jack the Ripper. An investigation led them to 52-year-old Gao Chengyong, and in August 2016, he was arrested at a grocery store he ran with his wife. On March 30th, 2018, 30 years after Gao attacked his first victim, he confessed to 11 killings and was sentenced to death. A year later, the sentence was carried out, bringing the nightmare of China's Jack the Ripper to an end. Burari deaths, India. In the early hours of July 1st, 2018, police were trying to wrap their minds around the scene playing out at a home in the bustling Burari neighborhood of Delhi. The bodies of 11 members of the Tundawat family had been found there. The oldest, a 77-year-old woman, had been strangled in a different room, while the other 10 were hanging from iron rods on the ceiling in a circular formation. The youngest was 12. They all wore blindfolds, their ears were plugged with cotton, and their mouths taped. Some even had their hands and legs tied. At first, the police thought it was a homicide, but then they found notebooks with handwritten instructions that pointed to something completely different. Back in 2007, Bhopal Singh, an uncle and father in the family, died from a respiratory illness. Up until then, the family was just like any other middle-class family. But after Singh's death, the family was shaken and began to find comfort in spiritual and mystical practices. They were urged on by Singh's son, Lalit Chundawat. He began to tell people that he was seeing the spirit of his late father in his dreams, telling them to perform certain rituals he claimed to have received from the spirit. When the family's financial fortune increased and a 30-year-old niece got engaged, the family was all the more convinced that Singh's spirit was guiding them. So, when Lalit told them Singh's spirit had given another instruction, they all jumped in. According to the notebook, that night, the family was instructed to perform a banyan tree worship ritual by hanging themselves. The police found CCTV footage that showed members of the family buying new stools just a few days before the incident. Other footage shows them buying the wires, scarves, and saris that would later be found around their necks. But the kicker is that they didn't expect that to happen. Based on the handwritten notes, Lalit fully believed that he and his family would return to life after the ritual, but that wasn't what happened. There is still one part of their deaths that has left the police stumped. They had found 11 pipes behind the house that do not connect to any source. Each of them seems to represent a member of the family, but the reason why they were put there remains a mystery to this day. Mass killings. Indonesia. In the 1960s, Indonesia had one of the largest communist parties in the world, the Partai Komunis Indonesia, or PKI for short. As the non-ruling party, they were a huge threat to the sitting government. So on September 30th, 1965, after an attempted coup that left 6 generals dead, the military seized it as an opportunity to reduce the popularity of communists and their supporters. They started by an airing of provocative radio broadcasts, newsletters, and anti-PKI literature, claiming that the PKI was behind the failed coup and calling for them to be eliminated. Then, the US began to supply Indonesian military with weapons and money. They also gave them names of senior Communist Party officials. Army and army-affiliated militias began to round up anyone who associated with the PKI or was suspected of being a communist. They were either arrested and forced into hard labor as political prisoners, or eliminated in violent mass executions. Others were imprisoned without trial, while the lucky few went into exile. There were others who also got involved in the killings. Muslim preachers who urged their congregations to eliminate anyone who was suspected of being a communist, and civilians who were celebrated as patriots and heroes for participating in the genocide. It became a thing of pride to boast about how many communists had met their end at one's hand. As riots broke out across the country, the state-controlled media blamed the violence on the PKI. In schools, children were indoctrinated to believe that communists were evil. Up until the 2000s, the genocide of 1965 was a taboo topic in India. Books that mentioned the mass killings were banned and burned, and activists protesting it often met terrible ends. As far as the Indonesian government was concerned, the genocide had been a necessary evil to stop the PKI from overthrowing the government. Then, the US would declassify documents that proved that they knew all along that PKI was not behind the coup. Yet, along with the British and US, the Indonesian government had created the disinformation campaign to rile up the people against communism. The genocide left more than 500,000 people dead, while others put the number at closer to 1 million. But so far, Indonesia refuses to acknowledge it. Level 7. My Lai Massacre, Vietnam. On March 15, 1968, American Army Captain Ernest Medina laid out a mission for soldiers of the Charlie Company to find members of the Viet Cong in My Lai, assuring them that all civilians had left the area and anyone left was a Viet Cong fighter or supporter. Early the next day, Charlie Company arrived at My Lai led by Lieutenant William Calley. Instead of their armed enemies, they found a village of civilians including women, children, and the elderly. But they didn't back down. Spurred on by Lieutenant Calley, they marched families to bomb shelters and threw in grenades after them. They rounded up others in ditches and fired at them. Women and girls were assaulted and attacked. Not even children were spared. As the massacre was taking place, helicopter pilot Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson was flying above My Lai when he spotted some wounded civilians. Thompson had no idea what was going on and radioed in for ground troops to help them. By the time he flew over again, they were all dead. Then he spotted more soldiers approaching, some women and children with guns drawn. Thompson landed his helicopter between the soldiers and the civilians, ordering his gunner to shoot anyone who fired at any civilians. Then he radioed in for more helicopters to fly them to safety. Dozens of Vietnamese were saved, but over 504 in My Lai and a neighboring community would not be so lucky. When Thompson returned to base, he reported what he had seen, but the army covered it up. They also began to send him out on increasingly dangerous missions. For a year, no one outside the Charlie Company knew what happened in My Lai. Then the New York Times published the story along with graphic images from the massacre. The public was horrified as the army continued to deny all of it. The few soldiers who admitted to what happened in My Lai claimed that they were only doing what they were told. Of all the troops with Charlie Company that pulled a trigger that day, only Lieutenant William Calley was found guilty of the execution of 22 Vietnamese civilians and was given a life sentence. He served only 3 days before President Richard Nixon ordered that his sentence be reduced. Calley ended up serving 3 years of house arrest for his war crimes. Meanwhile, it took 30 years for the army to recognize the chopper crew for their heroism. The My Lai Village Massacre remains one of the most notorious war crimes in modern American military history. Little Light Bulb Beheading, Taiwan. Shortly before noon on March 28, 2016, a 4-year-old girl nicknamed Little Light Bulb was cycling ahead of her mother to a metro station in the Taiwanese capital, Taipei. The bicycle suddenly got stuck and could not climb onto a sidewalk. As her mother caught up with her to help, 33-year-old Wang Qingyu came up from behind. At first, she thought he was going to help the 4-year-old pick up her bicycle, but then he suddenly began to attack her with a cleaver. Shocked, the mother tried to pull him off her but couldn't. By the time other people rushed to help, it was too late. Her head had been separated from her body. Wang was held down and later arrested. A mob of angry people gathered around, punching and hitting him as he was taken in. No one quite knows why he did it. There's no connection between him and the victim. Wang had a record of drug abuse and had been treated at a psychiatric hospital. According to police report, he had bought the cleaver that very morning and had been waiting at the station. Many believed it was a random attack brought on by untreated schizophrenia. He drank their saliva to gain superpowers. Indonesia. In 1997, a man was walking through a sugarcane field in North Sumatra, Indonesia, when he spotted a suspicious-looking mound of death. After digging, they found the body of Sri Kamala Dewi, who had been last seen alive on April 24th. Police launched an investigation and learned that she had been dropped off at the home of Ahmad Suraji. Suraji was a cattle breeder who was well respected in the community as a shaman and healer with great powers. There was even a rumor that he had powers that allowed him to move the clouds. On paper, he was the most unlikely suspect in Suri's death, notwithstanding the police questioned him. As expected, Suraji claimed he knew nothing about her death. However, when the police searched his home, they would find Suri's jewelry, dress, and bag. At first, Suraji denied any involvement in her death, only admitting that Suri had come to him for help getting back to her husband. But with all the evidence stacked against him, the shaman finally admitted he was behind Suri's death. But she wasn't his only victim. The police had found several female clothes buried in Suraji's goat pen. Realizing that he wasn't getting out of it, Suraji confessed. 11 years earlier, in 1986, when the shaman was 34, his father had come to him in a dream. He told Suraji that he would become an invincible mystic healer if he drank the saliva of 70 women. While his father hadn't expressly told him to eliminate anyone, Suraji decided that was the faster way. As a local shaman and sorcerer, he already had a lot of women coming to him for help with spiritual problems. From wives who had marital problems to single women wanting husbands, women didn't want anyone to know they were visiting him. When the women came, Suraji advised them that he needed to conduct rituals. He He would take them to the sugarcane field. Sometimes the women would meet an already dug hole. Other times, Suraji would tell them to dig. The women had no idea they were digging their own graves. For the next step, Suraji told them that he needed to tie their hands and feet before placing them in the holes and burying them up to their waist. Once they were in the holes, Suraji would strangle them, then suck out their saliva. The police made him walk them through the disturbing process. Then, he got his third wife, Tumini, to help strip the women and bury their bodies with their heads faced at his home, stemmed from a belief that their spirits would go directly to him. When clients weren't coming, he hired prostitutes. The police recovered the bones and bodies of 42 women in that sugarcane field, and Suraji confessed to all of it. Suraji's third wife, who stripped the bodies and helped bury them, was sentenced to death, but her sentence would later be commuted to life. As for Suraji, he was also sentenced to death, and he faced the firing squad in 2008, ending the life of one of Indonesia's most notorious serial killers.